A War Cabinet member, Benny Gantz, is certainly making his rounds abroad. After a somewhat tense trip to the United States, Gantz is now in the UK, meeting with the National Security Advisor and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Gantz already wrapped up his meeting with British Foreign Secretary David Cameron, who said he had a tough but necessary talk with Gantz about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So to talk about the latest visit to the UK, I'm joined by I-24 News UK correspondent Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, let's first talk about what we know about Gantz's meeting with Cameron and possibly what we should expect from the meeting with Sunak.
Well, from Gantz's spokesman, we know that he did meet with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, though the Foreign Office here have not confirmed that to me, and it's not been made public on the UK side, which in itself is interesting. We do know that there was a meeting they were able to release notice of, and that was with the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, who also released a statement which really echoed what he said yesterday in the House of Lords as to what he was going to say to Mr. Gantz. And that statement said that Britain has called for an immediate humanitarian pause, increased capacity for aid distribution inside Gaza, increased access through both land and maritime routes, and then interestingly, an expansion of the types of aid that can be brought into Gaza. That's in reference perhaps to what he said yesterday, which is that Britain wants to see many more things allowed in, not just food, but also some sorts of materials that could be for making shelter and the like. And they have said that Israel is stopping those things going in because they may have a dual use, meaning they could be hijacked and used by Hamas for terror purposes. So much of what we've heard today is what we've been hearing already for a while from Cameron. And also the statement said that Britain made it clear that they're very concerned about the prospect of more military action in Rafah, and that this is something that Britain is very anxious about. But really nothing particularly has changed, just more of the same messaging, and it's getting more and more determined on the part of Great Britain.
Meanwhile, when it comes to what's happening with Israel's war, it's certainly become more of a dominant issue in British politics. Quite a bit of alarm last week when anti-Zionist George Galloway won an election, becoming a member of Parliament. So how does the ongoing war play into the anti-Zionism, that we're seeing in the UK right now?
Well, I notice you hesitating over the word anti-Semitism, but it is a key issue here in the UK as well as what they're calling anti-Zionism and general anti-Israel sentiment. Some people even going as far as to call it pro-Hamas sentiment. And I think that you've hit upon something there, which is that there is a lot of noise in Britain, especially among some parts of the population, and then that's resonating upwards into Parliament and MPs about disapproval of Israel's actions. I think there are also a lot of people, some of them very pro-Palestinian themselves, who say it's got nothing to do with the plight of the Palestinian people, and actually it's just playing on divisions within British society. There are people who are using the Palestinian cause as a way to bash Jewish community, bash Israel, or even to bash politicians. George Galloway is somebody who has a long history of anti-Israel sentiment and action. He's also somebody that has himself been to Gaza, has handed cash over in bags to Hamas leaders. So it's clear that he is somebody that is definitely opposed to the state of Israel. He once refused to debate a student who was a dual British-Israeli citizen, and that student now is a spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister's office. So there is a long history of Galloway's anti-Israel sentiment, and he is now back in the Houses of Parliament as an MP, having won that by-election in Rochdale. All of this, I think, says more about the really what's going on in the United Kingdom than it does about what's going on in Israel. But of course, Israel, as ever, has become a touch point for those people in order to express themselves in a way that they feel they can express those feelings, which are putting a lot of fear into many in the British Jewish community, but not necessarily with much effect for people in Israel or indeed in Gaza itself.
So with Gantz's visit then, you said we haven't really heard any of a change in the sentiment when it's coming from any of the members of Parliament or any of the leading officials. So what really should we expect to come following this?
Well, David Cameron is speaking out quite boldly in terms of some of his criticism of Israel, and that is disappointing to some who point out that Britain is meant to still be backing Israel's actions. I mean, in the statement, he did end by saying the UK supports Israel's right to self-defense, but as the occupying power in Gaza, Israel has a legal responsibility to ensure aid is available for civilians, and that responsibility has consequences, including when we as the UK assess whether Israel is compliant with international humanitarian law. So far, not saying that Israel isn't compliant with international law, but of course the implication is that if Israel is found not to be complying with international law, then British arms trade with Israel should be cancelled by the rules that Britain supplies those arms to Israel. So there are all sorts of, let's say, threats or suggestions of what might happen, and David Cameron is getting closer and closer to saying that Britain is changing its policy. Many, of course, are quite confused by David Cameron's position on this. It sounds more like the sort of thing that one heard from Jeremy Corbyn when he was the Labour leader in opposition. For example, the idea of recognising a Palestinian state is something that Jeremy Corbyn long championed. It's not something anyone expected to hear from a conservative government in the United Kingdom, least of all at a time when Israel is fighting what is an existential war against an enemy that invaded brutally on the 7th of October. So there is some surprise at how the tone is changing. And I think that really, in meeting Gantz even, Britain has been quite clear that despite being told not to go by the Prime Minister of Israel, the democratically elected Prime Minister, whether people like him or not, they still met with Gantz. He met the Prime Minister, he met the Foreign Minister, just as he was met in the US. I think it shows that Britain itself is engaging as well, even in that internal politics in Israel, meeting somebody who could well be the opposition, the replacement for Benjamin Netanyahu, should things go wrong for him.